Hello and welcome to today's episode of the Jacksonville Jaguars Insider Podcast. My name is John Shipley. I am your host and beat reporter, and I have been your beat reporter covering Jacksonville Jaguars for On SI every single day since August 2019, and we are continuing to move forward through yet another season together. As always, you can always find our 100% free, 24/7 boots on the ground coverage of the Jacksonville Jaguars when you follow us on social media such as Facebook or Twitter, at Jaguars on SI. You can also find us at www.si.com/NFL/Jaguars. All right, folks, welcome to today's episode of the Jacksonville Jaguars Insider Podcast. My name is John Shipley. Today we are going to be talking about the winners and losers from the Jaguars 53-man roster cut down. Now, the Jaguars have made a couple of moves, since the 53-man roster is officially formed, mostly along the practice squad. But ultimately, it looks like what you see with the Jaguars roster is what you're going to get. So we're going to go ahead and do two winners, two losers for each side. The first winner, I think the biggest one, is probably Cole Van Lanen. I think Cole Van Lanen went from seeing them add guys like Fred Johnson, like Chuma Edoga, like Wyatt Milam, like Patrick McCarry in the offseason, and it became a very legitimate question of where does Cole Van Lanen fit in? And for me, Van Lanen, even without practicing much during training camp because of an injury, the fact that he makes the roster is a testament to who he is off the field, in the meeting room, what his reputation is. Tony Mazzelli, the EVP, he's been watching this Jaguars team for years. So he knows what Cole Van Lanen brings to the table. And I'm not sure if it was their plan to keep Cole Van Lanen when they had signed all these offensive linemen in free agency, but they end up trading Fred Johnson to the Philadelphia Eagles for a seventh round pick, And to me, the Jaguars only do that if they envision a role for Cole Van Lanen, not just as a ninth lineman and a potential, inactive on game day. No. They view him as a legitimate, in my opinion, role player. I think that, when he got hurt, it happened about the week of their first scrimmage, so, a little bit before their first preseason game. I think when Van Lanen got hurt, you saw a lot of experimentation at offensive tackle because of Van Lanen's status. And I'm not sure Van Lanen will necessarily be available week one, but he did practice on Thursday, which was the last full open practice that we're going to see. We'll now see, about 10-minute stretch period, etc., and maybe some individual drills, and that's about it. But the fact that Van Lanen was out there is a good sign. And for Van Lanen, to be available for this team once injuries hit, I think, is critical. If injuries hit, but it is the offensive line. So to me, for example, I think Van Lanen, has a chance to legitimately get some key reps out there if anything ever happens to Walker Little or Anton Harrison. And with Fred Johnson here, that was simply not the case. The Jaguars had too many next guys up. But with Fred Johnson gone and the 53-man roster now constructed as is, I think that is a big, big win for Cole Van Lanen moving forward and his vision of filling a key role in the Jaguars' offensive line. Now, I thought, we'll go to losers real quick. I thought one of the losers of the 53-man roster cut down, it will sound a bit odd, but I'll say the rookie running backs. I know some fantasy places ran with what I wrote in my 53-man roster projection, which was that I said, I believe the Jaguars will try to unload one of their veteran running backs. If they don't, they'll carry 4. I still believe the Jaguars would be willing to take calls or to make calls on their veteran running backs. Just because a trade didn't happen, of course, doesn't mean that it wasn't a potential option. But once the trade didn't happen, the Jaguars were clearly always going to keep 4 running backs. So, Bayshaw Tune and LaQuint Allen are 2 guys who very easily were always going to make the roster. But now, with 4 running backs on the team, those 2 rookies in addition to Travis Etienne and Tank Bigsby, I do think it's a legitimate question of how much do these rookies actually play. Because Tank Bigsby has carried the load before in the running game. He did it last year. Served as a real workhorse when Travis Etienne was dealing with injuries. Etienne has been the leading rusher as well. Has, 1,000-yard season under his belt. Scored a lot of touchdowns in 2023 before everything kind of went wrong for him in 2024. And it's clear those 2 guys are going to be active. And it's even more clear that the Jaguars won't have 4 running backs active on game day. It's going to be 3. So one of LaQuint Allen or Bayshaw Tune, just simply because of the fact that no new news happened at the running back position, are guys who ultimately are impacted, completely by how the 53-man roster is formed. Now, for my second winner, I'm going to go Yasir Abdullah. Yasir Abdullah, I thought, had a nice preseason, had a nice training camp. He definitely entered the offseason as a guy who, on my radar, and this is just mine, I thought he was a fringe roster player. I thought he was completely on the bubble, if not outside of the bubble, looking in. But because of how the room is constructed, the Jaguars have 2 backups at each linebacker position. And obviously, Dennis Gardeck is the Jaguars starting Sam linebacker. But Yasir Abdullah has gotten a lot of reps there during the preseason, etc. In my opinion, made the most of them. So, Yasir Abdullah, a guy who a lot of people had pegged as getting cut entering training camp, ends up, making it through the storm and making it to the roster. Now, I do think an injury to rookie linebacker Jalen McLeod probably played a role. But I'm just going to say probably. I'm not going to say I believe that Yasir Abdullah is only on the roster because Jalen McLeod wasn't able to be. But I do ultimately think that for Yasir Abdullah, this was a chance for him to either, crap or get off the pot, more or less. Are you going to make your mark in Jacksonville, or is it time for them to move on? So, to me, a strong preseason and a strong training camp from Yasir Abdullah, he has to be a winner. And now, finally, the loser. It's hard for me to say there's a loser. Really. Because, again, there weren't that many surprises or anything like that. But I will probably have to say, if I had to pick one, Heath Farwell, in my opinion. Losing Daniel Thomas, to me, was that significant of a move. And it's still a move where, I get it. They drafted his replacement, a very cheap replacement, mind you, in Ray Lane, who had a great training camp preseason. I have no doubt in my mind that he's going to be a good special teams player. However, could they not have kept Antonio Johnson and kept Ray Lane and then moved on from Antonio Johnson, keeping Daniel Thomas in the fold in the process? I think it was a legitimate question to ask. I do think that for as good as Lane has been on special teams and for as good as they say Johnson is, that losing a guy like Thomas is always going to be significant. Thomas was one of the NFL's best at what he did. I mean, anybody remembers that great rep against the Baltimore Ravens a couple years ago? That's who he was every single play. And I think moving on from Thomas and doing so for the rookie, I get doing it for. That I understand. Doing it for a third-year safety who has looked a little lost on defense at times, that I am not sure I can, come to terms with and agree with as much. Because ultimately, this Jaguar safety position, while having a host of bodies who have started, is still looking for a starter. That is all we have for you guys for today on today's episode of the Jacksonville Jaguars Insider Podcast. Please make sure you like, review, follow, and subscribe, and give me your thoughts. And as always, I'll be back next time.